For years, people have asked the same question about Jana Duggar. Why is she still single? But inside the Duggar family, that question was never the focus. Because over the years, Michelle Duggar has often spoken about Jana in a very specific way. Not as someone waiting for life to begin, but as someone who was always there. She's been described as dependable, patient, the one who stepped in naturally when the house was busy and the younger kids needed help. Not forced, not asked publicly, just present. And when a mother speaks about her daughter like that, it quietly changes the story. Because Jana wasn't standing still. She was carrying responsibility. While others moved into new chapters, Jana kept things steady at home, without announcements, without explanations. So maybe the real question isn't why Jana Duggar is still single. Maybe it's this: what happens when a woman gives years of her life to family and only later chooses herself? Stay with me, because Jana Duggar's story isn't about what she didn't do. It's about what she quietly held together. For years, the world has looked at Jana Duggar and asked one question: why is she still single? But inside the Duggar family, that question was never framed the same way, because when Michelle Duggar has spoken about Jana over the years, she hasn't described her as someone waiting for life to start. She's described her as someone who was already living it. Michelle has often talked about how Jana was always there, steady, dependable, and deeply involved in the daily rhythm of the home, not in a dramatic way. Not as a sacrifice story, but as a simple truth. Jana was the one who stepped in naturally when the house was busy, when younger kids needed guidance, when routines needed order, and when a mother speaks about her daughter like that, it quietly reframes everything, because Jana wasn't standing still. She was holding things together. While the world watched weddings and milestones, Jana's role stayed mostly off camera. No applause, no countdown, just consistency. And that consistency came with weight. Responsibility doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just settles in day after day until it becomes part of who you are. So when people say Jana didn't move forward, they misunderstand what forward looked like for her. Forward meant showing up. Forward meant being reliable. Forward meant putting family first, long before anyone asked her to explain her own plans. Michelle's tone has always mattered here. Not pressure, not urgency, but appreciation. And that tells us something important. Jana wasn't being held back. She wasn't missing chances. She was trusted to help, trusted to lead quietly, trusted to be the calm center of a very busy home. And when someone carries that role for years, their timeline changes. Not because they're unsure, but because they're already needed. So before we ask why Jana Duggar didn't rush into marriage, we have to understand the life she was already living. Because this story doesn't start with a ring. It starts with responsibility. And that's where Jana Duggar's real journey begins. When you hear the Duggar family talk about Jana, a pattern begins to emerge. They don't describe her as someone who hesitated. They describe her as someone who stepped up. Michelle Duggar has often spoken about how Jana naturally took on responsibility as the family grew, not because she was told to, but because she could be counted on. And over time, that kind of trust changes the shape of a life. Responsibilities start small, helping here, organizing there. But in a large household, small responsibilities don't stay small for long. They multiply. They settle in. They become routine. And before you realize it, choice quietly moves to the background. Not taken away, just postponed. That's the part people outside the family rarely see. Jana didn't wake up one day and decide to delay her own future. Her role slowly expanded around her. And because she handled it well, more responsibility followed. Michelle's tone when mentioning Jana has always been steady, not urgent, not regretful. Almost as if the family understood that Jana's presence was holding something important in place. And when a family depends on someone like that, they don't rush them. They rely on them. So while the public counted years and milestones, Jana was counting needs. Who needed help? What needed order? Which day needed structure? And in that rhythm, time moved differently. This is why the question, why didn't she leave earlier, doesn't fully fit, because leaving isn't always about wanting to go. Sometimes it's about knowing when it's possible. And for Jana, possibility came slowly, not because she lacked courage, but because her life was already full of responsibility. And as the family dynamic began to shift, something else started to change as well. Space. Space to breathe. Space to imagine. Space to choose. And that's when Jana's story takes a turn, not away from family, but toward herself. For a long time, Jana Duggar's role inside the family felt fixed. She was the dependable one, the steady presence, the person everyone counted on. And when the Duggar family talked about her, that description rarely changed. But over time, something subtle happened. The family began to change. Younger siblings grew up. Household routines shifted. Responsibilities slowly redistributed. And when Michelle Duggar has spoken about this season, the tone is different. Not because something was wrong, but because something had evolved. Jana wasn't needed in the same way anymore. And for someone who had carried responsibility for so long, that shift can feel unfamiliar, not empty, just quiet. This is where many people misunderstand Jana's story. They assume change must come with conflict, or distance, or declarations. But Jana's change didn't arrive that way. It arrived through space. Space to step back. Space to focus on her own interests. Space to live at a pace that finally belonged to her. And the family seemed to recognize that. There was no rush, no pressure to catch up. Because when someone has given so much of themselves, the next chapter doesn't need urgency. It needs respect. This is why when fans look at Jana today, they see something different. Not hesitation, not uncertainty, but calm. A kind of steadiness that comes from knowing you've done what was asked of you, and now you're free to choose what comes next. And that brings us to the question that matters most. if Jana Duggar isn't waiting and she isn't behind, then what is she preparing for? That answer takes us deeper into her story. One of the most striking things about Jana Duggar is not what she has said. It's what she hasn't. For years, questions followed her. Timelines, expectations, assumptions. But Jana never stepped forward to explain herself. And inside the Duggar family, that silence was never treated as a problem. Because when Michelle Duggar has spoken about Jana, she's often emphasized character over commentary, showing up, being present, doing what needed to be done, not defending choices, not announcing plans, just living. In a family that spent so much of its life in the public eye, silence became a form of protection. And Jana used it well. She didn't correct rumors. She didn't respond to pressure. She didn't turn her personal timeline into public content. And that wasn't avoidance. It was boundaries. Boundaries that said, my life doesn't need to be explained to be valid. The Duggar family never framed Jana's quietness as uncertainty. They framed it as maturity, because not everyone needs to narrate their journey for it to be real. Some people live their choices slowly without spectacle, and Jana did exactly that, which is why, as time passed, the questions around her began to change. People stopped asking when. They started asking why she seemed so at peace. And peace doesn't come from indecision. It comes from alignment, from knowing your role, fulfilling it fully, and then stepping into the next season without noise. Jana never explained herself because she didn't need permission. And that quiet confidence is what makes her story resonate now more than ever. Over time, something unexpected happened. Jana Duggar's silence started to speak. Not in statements, not in interviews, but in contrast. As more Duggar siblings built lives outside the spotlight, people began to notice how differently Jana carried herself. There was no rush, no explanation tour, no effort to catch up. And inside the family, that calm was understood, because when Michelle Duggar has reflected on Jana's role, the message has been consistent. Jana didn't need to prove anything. She had already given years of her life to responsibility that few people ever see. And that kind of contribution doesn't disappear just because it isn't photographed. Jana's silence became a quiet lesson that a woman's worth isn't measured by speed, that timelines don't define depth, that choosing peace can be stronger than choosing visibility. For many fans watching from the outside, this was unfamiliar. We're used to stories that announce themselves, that explain every turn, that demand attention. But Jana's story did the opposite. It invited reflection. And slowly, the narrative around her began to shift. Not from speculation, but from respect. People stopped framing her as left behind. They started seeing her as grounded. Someone who had lived fully inside one season before stepping into the next. And that's why Jana Duggar's story resonates beyond her family, because it reflects something many people feel but rarely say out loud. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is live your life quietly on your own terms. And as we move forward, one truth becomes clear. Jana's silence didn't hold her back. It shaped her. One of the biggest misunderstandings about Jana Duggar is the idea that choosing herself meant leaving everything behind. Inside the Duggar family, that's never how her story has been framed. Because when Michelle Duggar has spoken about Jana in recent years, the emphasis hasn't been on separation. It's been on balance. Jana didn't reject her upbringing. She didn't turn away from her values. She didn't make her independence loud or confrontational. She adjusted. And that difference matters for someone who spent years putting family first. Choosing herself didn't look like escape. It looked like intention. She began shaping her days differently, giving space to her own interests, setting a rhythm that reflected who she had become, not just who she had been needed to be. And the family seemed to respect that shift. There was no narrative of conflict, no talk of disappointment, just acceptance. Because growth doesn't always mean breaking away. Sometimes it means standing in the same place with clearer boundaries. Jana showed that it's possible to honor where you come from while still listening to who you are now. And that quiet example carried weight, especially for those watching who felt torn between loyalty and self-respect. Jana didn't choose one over the other. She chose both, and that choice reframed her story once again. This wasn't about waiting. It wasn't about fear. It was about timing, about understanding that some seasons are for giving and others are for becoming. And Jana Duggar entered that new season without needing permission. For a long time, the headline followed Jana Duggar everywhere. Still single? It was simple, clickable, easy to repeat. But inside the Duggar family, that word was never used the same way. Because when Michelle Duggar and others close to the family have spoken about Jana, they didn't focus on what was missing. They focused on what was present: stability, commitment, purpose. The label, still single, suggests delay, as if life is on pause. But Jana's life was never paused. It was full of responsibility, full of contribution, full of quiet leadership. And when you look at it that way, the headline doesn't just feel incomplete. It feels wrong, because still single only makes sense if marriage is the starting line, and Jana's life proves that it isn't. Inside the family, her story has always been about trust. Trust that she knew her role. Trust that she would step forward when ready. Trust that her timing didn't need outside approval. That trust matters because it explains why there was never panic around her choices. No urgency. No pressure campaign. Just space. And space is something you give to someone you respect. So maybe the headline should change. Still single. Still grounded. Still steady. Still choosing her life with intention. And when you see Jana Duggar through that lens, the story shifts completely. This isn't a story about what she didn't do. It's a story about how she lived fully, quietly, and on her own terms. And that's the part people are finally starting to understand. One thing the Duggar family has always done differently is how they handle silence. Not every story is explained. Not every choice is defended. And when it comes to Jana Duggar, that silence speaks louder than any statement. Because if there had been concern, pressure, or urgency inside the family, it would have shown. But it didn't. When Michelle Duggar has referenced Jana over the years, there's been a calm consistency. No hints of worry. No sense of something unfinished. Just reassurance, and that matters. Families don't stay quiet when they're anxious. They don't avoid timelines when they're afraid. Silence, in this case, signals comfort. It tells us that Jana's choices were understood even if they weren't explained publicly. And that understanding created something rare, freedom without conflict. Jana didn't have to justify her pace because the people closest to her already trusted it. That's why the family never rushed to redefine her story. They let it unfold, and in doing so, they allowed Jana to step into the next season of her life without pressure or spectacle. For many watching from the outside, this felt unfamiliar, but inside the family, it felt natural. Because when someone has given years of steady presence, they earn the right to move quietly. And Jana did exactly that. Which brings us to an important realization. The Duggar family's silence was never avoidance. It was confidence. Confidence in Jana. Confidence in her timing. Confidence that her story didn't need explaining to be valid. At some point, Jana Duggar's story stopped being just about her. It started reflecting something much larger. Because when people look at Jana now, they don't just see a Duggar daughter. They see a familiar feeling, the feeling of being dependable on, of being the one others rely on, of putting personal plans on hold because someone else needs you. And inside the Duggar family, this was never framed as weakness. When Michelle Duggar has spoken about Jana's role, the emphasis has always been on steadiness, not sacrifice. That distinction matters because many women watching recognize that pattern instantly. Being strong without being loud, being needed without being praised, being present without being seen. Jana's life quietly validates those experiences. It says you're not behind, you're not late, wrong, you're not invisible. You're living a season that just doesn't come with applause. And when that season changes, you don't have to explain the shift. You're allowed to choose yourself without rewriting your past. That's why Jana's story resonates so deeply now. Not because of marriage, not because of speculation, but because it gives language to something many people have lived through without ever naming it. Inside the Duggar family, this understanding seems to have been present all along, which is why Jana was never rushed, never framed as incomplete, never treated as a question mark. She was trusted, and that trust echoes far beyond one family because it reminds people, it's people everywhere, that your timeline doesn't have to match anyone else's to be meaningful. And as Jana continues forward, her story becomes less about curiosity and more about connection. As Jana Duggar moves into a quieter chapter of her life, the question naturally shifts. Not why didn't she, but what now? Inside the Duggar family, There's never been a sense of urgency around that question, because when Michelle Duggar and others close to the family have spoken about Jana, the tone has always been patient, almost expectant, but not demanding. Jana's future was never treated like a problem to solve. It was treated like a story still unfolding. And that changes everything, because when a woman has spent years meeting the needs of others, what comes next doesn't have to follow a script. It can be shaped slowly, intentionally, on her own terms. Maybe it includes marriage. Maybe it doesn't. The family has never framed either outcome as failure. What matters is readiness, not appearance. And readiness looks different when you've already lived a full season of responsibility. Jana has shown that she values alignment over speed, that she's willing to wait not because she's unsure, but because she's certain of what she wants her life to feel like. Calm, grounded, meaningful. So when people speculate about what comes next, they often miss the point. The point isn't the outcome, it's the agency. Jana Duggar now stands in a position where she gets to choose without pressure. And that freedom is something she's earned. For a long time, the Duggar family was seen through a single lens. Marriage, timelines, tradition. That was the story most people recognized. But Jana Duggar's journey quietly added a new layer, not by challenging the family publicly, not by rejecting where she came from, but by living differently while staying close. Inside the family, this shift wasn't dramatic, it was subtle, and sometimes subtle change lasts longer. When Michelle Duggar and others have reflected on Jana's role, they've never suggested that her path was a deviation. They've treated it as part of the family's natural evolution. That matters, because it shows that the Duggar story isn't frozen in time. It's growing. Jana's life demonstrated that there is more than one way to be faithful, responsible, and fulfilled. More than one way to honor family without disappearing into expectation. And as that understanding settled in, the narrative around the family softened. Fans stopped seeing one fixed model. They began seeing individuals, different paths, different seasons, different timelines. Jana didn't announce this shift. She embodied it. And that's why her story carries weight without controversy. It didn't break the Duggar narrative. It expanded it. And in doing so, it allowed others in the family and outside it to imagine more than one version of a meaningful life. Jana Duggar's story matters because it never demanded attention. It didn't arrive with an announcement. It didn't rely on controversy. It didn't need explanation to exist. And that, in today's world, is exactly why it stayed with people. Inside the Duggar family, Jana was never treated as unfinished. When Michelle Duggar has spoken about her over the years, the tone was never anxious. It was calm, assured, grounded, as if the family understood something the outside world took longer to see. That Jana's life didn't need to look busy to be meaningful. That contribution doesn't have to be loud to be real. For years, Jana gave stability in a home that rarely slowed down. She gave structure when structure was needed. She gave presence when presence mattered most. And she did it without turning herself into a headline. That kind of life doesn't fit neatly into internet labels. It doesn't translate well into quick judgments, but it leaves a mark. And over time, people began to feel that mark. They stopped asking when Jana would move on. They started noticing how steady she already was, how calm, how rooted, how unbothered by expectations she never agreed to. Jana's story became a mirror for women who were dependable before they were celebrated, for people who stayed when it would have been easier to leave, for anyone who gave years of their life to responsibility and quietly wondered if it would ever be their turn. Her life answered that question without words. Yes, but not on someone else's timeline. And that's what makes her story timeless. It reminds us that purpose isn't delayed just because it's quiet. That growth doesn't always look like movement. Sometimes it looks like patience, consistency, and knowing when to wait. Inside the Duggar family, that understanding seems to have always been there. That's why Jana was never rushed, never reframed as incomplete, never spoken about with concern. She was trusted, and trust is something you earn over time, not through speed, but through presence. Today, Jana Duggar stands not as a question mark, but as a reminder that a meaningful life doesn't need to follow a script, that choosing peace is a form of strength, and that sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that never ask to be believed. They simply live. And Jana Duggar's story did exactly that.